Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a Christmas-themed exclusive from a good friend, James Williams. As ever, please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into the Christmas festivities, entitled Santa Jaws, a Christmas Horror. Let's get straight into that. It was Christmas Eve, 1987. Marcus and Zoe sat in chairs on opposite sides of the gurney holding Brandy's hands. Brandy slept comfortably on an IV drip of fluids and painkillers. The blanket that was draped over her came to an abrupt drop-off about halfway between her waist and where her knees used to be. Marcus and Zoe had to make up a story as to how Brandy lost her legs and for the disappearance of their friend, Billy. The truth was just too horrible and insane to repeat. No one would have believed them anyway. They were just kids, after all. A few days earlier, when Billy Everett and his twin sister Zoe moved to the neighborhood, they hit off with Marcus and Brandy, cousins that lived across the street from each other. Separately, they were typical, mischievous kids in their early teens, but altogether, they would be real terrors. They were always getting into trouble or running off on adventures. When Zoe heard of an abandoned Santa's village, it was all she could do to keep it secret until the perfect time. When school let out for Christmas break, she announced her idea for them to go explore the supposedly haunted novelty village. So I did some research and the place is 3 miles outside of town, Zoe said, laying out an old map for the others to look at. It was abandoned 30 years ago. The official story is that there was a gas leak that forced an inspection. The fake snow was asbestos, the paint was lead-based, and the wiring and plumbing, they were outdated, and some of the buildings were about to fall in. All this combined caused it to shut down. While explaining this, she pulled out printed copies of newspaper clippings. However, at the same time, 6 children disappeared while visiting the village with their parents. I suspect this was the real reason that it was closed, but without any evidence, there was no arrest. And the best part, this all took place right before Christmas, she said with a grin. Billy shook his head. You outdid yourself this time, sis. And did they have a suspect? He said, setting his backpack onto the table next to the map. Well, that's the thing. The village was bought out earlier that year by the same guy that dressed as Santa. The same day, the sheriff forced him to shut down the place. He disappeared. And since then, it's been off limits and no longer appears on maps, Zoe replied. This is going to be awesome, Marcus chimed in, to which they all agreed. That night, the 4 prepared for the trip, packing snacks, drinks, and supplies for the journey. Each had their own flashlight and radio, but also brought their own unique item. Marcus had a pocket knife given to him by his father. Brandy, an aspiring doctor, carried a first aid kit. And Zoe, who had her eye on being an investigative journalist, had saved up her allowance and bought a Polaroid camera, making her the envy of their grade. And Billy had a flare gun that he took from his dad's emergency kit, though this would be the first time he'd ever left home with it. And the following morning, they said goodbye to their parents and met at a park where they usually hung out. And before starting off their trek, they went over the plan one more time. Looking over the old map and a new one for the best route to the village, it was determined that they would have to walk half a mile to the closest road leading to the abandoned village. And from there, it was a 3-mile hike to their destination, which was shown to be a wooded area. And the idea was to get there, explore the village, take a few snapshots and souvenirs, and be home before dark. And for most of the hike, It was the usual fun and games, chatting and cracking jokes. When they came to the woodline, things became a little more serious. None of them had ventured this far from home before, and none of them were familiar with this part of the forest. Still, they were young teens and acted as such while keeping an eye out for danger. "How did you find out about this place anyway?" Marcus said. "You know the janitor at school? Chuck something?" Zoe asked in return. "Chunky Chuck? That dude is weird," Brandy scoffed, wrinkling her nose. "Yeah, him. I overheard him and Sheriff Thompson talking about it. The county is planning to demolish it and build a mall or something. Chuck wasn't too happy about it since the village is technically on his family's land," Zoe replied. "His family's land?" asked Billy, and Zoe nodded. "Yeah, his grandfather. He started a village as a way to bring tourists to the area. It worked for a while, but eventually it was just the townies going to it and it started falling apart. He sold out to some guy that wanted to keep it running, but the land was still his. Now the county is taking it, building a new road and a mall," she said, showing the notes she had taken during her research. "Again I say, you outdid yourself this time, sis," Billy said, and she grinned. It wasn't too much longer before the first remnants of the village came into view. Once red and white spiraling posts that supported the entrance sign were now discoloured and overgrown in moss. The sign was in pieces, rotted apart, with barely any letters left. Zoe took out her camera and took a picture of the entrance, and then had the others pose for another photo. They followed the trail, with the remains of buildings lying in shambles. The forest had all but reclaimed this area, not leaving much to explore. The one building that remained, mostly intact, was Santa's workshop. It stood at the end of the street, surrounded by cobblestone walkways with grass growing between the cracks. "Looks like our options are limited," Marcus said, motioning to the main building. Zoe snapped a few more pictures as the rest of the group started looking for a way into the workshop. "Has anyone tried the front door?" she asked, walking up the steps. "Yeah, like they just leave the doors unlocked," her brother scoffed. And Zoe rolled her eyes, placed a finger onto the door and pushed, half expecting it to remain solid, half thinking it might barely budge. To her and everyone else's surprise, the door opened with ease. The hinges creaked, but otherwise there was no resistance. "How do you like your crowbar, bro?" Zoe said in a mocking tone. "Nah, nah, 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 nah," he said, mocking her back. Billy, Marcus and Brandy made their way up the steps and into the building behind Zoe. Inside was dark and musty. Everyone took out their flashlights and turned them on, shining in different directions, looking for anything interesting. "Check it out," Brandy whispered, pointing her light into a room with an arched doorway. "Why are you whispering?" Billy said, his voice echoing in the open room. "That's why. There might be some hobo or animals living in here," Brandy retorted. "Any hobos home?" Billy yelled, echoing even more now. "Dude," Marcus said, shoving him a little, and Billy barely stumbled, grinning. The girls rolled their eyes and headed on into the room that Brandy pointed out, followed by the boys. There were toys strewn about, moulded and rotted apart. Shelves were barely holding on, and the desk in the centre had collapsed in on itself. And picking through the rubble, Billy pulled out an old cash box. "Oh, check it out," Billy said, showing the contents. There were a few dollars in cash and change. "Splitsies," Zoe called out. "Nope, all mine," Billy said, shoving the money into his pockets. You know the rule, Billy. We share everything," Marcus pointed out. Fine. We'll divvy it up later," Billy agreed. Another couple of minutes in this room turned up nothing interesting, and the same went for several other rooms. Brandy scored some medical supplies from sealed containers in what was once an infirmary, and Zoe found a retro camera that needed repair. Marcus took a sharpening stone from the kitchen, and Billy, on the other hand, hadn't found anything worth taking, other than the money, of course. And finally, they reached the last room, preceded by a red and white spiraling archway that had faded with time. Against the back wall of this room was a large, throne-like chair. In it sat Santa Claus. The figure was slumped to one side. His clothes were faded and not nearly as fat as Santa was supposed to be. "Think that's the owner that disappeared?" Brandy whispered. "Could be," Marcus replied. And without warning, Billy dropped his pack and bounded up the steps and flopped onto Santa's lap. "Dude, what the hell are you doing?" Marcus all but yelled. "I want to tell Santa what I want for Christmas," Billy said in a snarky tone. "Bilford Lee Everett, get down right now," Zoe said in her mum's voice, stamping her foot and pointing to the floor. "You're not Mum, Zoe. You can't tell me what to do," Billy yelled back, standing with his fists on his hips. Brandy took a couple of steps up towards him and was about to speak up but froze, turning white and wide-eyed. Marcus and Zoe too stared in silent shock. "What?" Billy said. An odd crinkling, wet, squelching noise behind him got his attention, making him turn around. Santa was now standing and looking down at him. The folds of the red and white coat were now parted, revealing a sideways mouth lined with sharp teeth and a tentacle-like tongue. Well, Billy froze in fear as his eyes locked with the hazy red eyes of whatever was wearing the Santa suit. In a flash, its hands with claw-tipped fingers snatched him up and shoved him into its mouth. It slammed its jaw shut so hard that Billy's body popped like a water balloon, spraying his friends with blood. Its mouth worked to chew its victim, bones crunching behind its closed, blood-soaked lips. The others could only stare in horror as the thing ate their friend. "We gotta get out of here," Marcus yelled, yanking Brandy off the steps and grabbing Billy's bag. And Zoe was still frozen in place, unable to process the fact that her brother, her twin, was gone. "Zoe, move it!" Marcus yelled again, pushing Brandy ahead and going back to get his other remaining friend. Brandy was crying and shaking uncontrollably as she ran, following behind the other two. And Zoe, on the other hand, allowed herself to be pulled along but continued to stare blankly into space. Marcus was barely keeping it together himself, being driven by fear and adrenaline to lead the other two to safety. And when they reached the front door, the three of them slammed into it, but it wouldn't open. Marcus pulled and pushed, but for some unknown reason, the door wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he exclaimed, kicking at the door with no improvement. The sound of heavy footfalls rapidly approaching echoed all around them. "Come on," Marcus said, pulling the other two along into one of the rooms they had searched previously and ducking behind a desk. The three squatted down and listened as Santa roamed the hall, looking for them. It grunted and sniffed loudly, its boots thumping on the wooden floor with each step. At the worst possible moment, Zoe finally snapped out of her daze and began crying. Shh, I know," Marcus whispered, pulling her close to him and trying to muffle the noise that she was making. Too late. Santa came barreling into the room, grabbed the desk on one side and flicked it against the wall. Its torso opened up, letting out a roar that sounded more like a gargled belch. The three screamed as it reached for them, but all three managed to dodge its grasp, clambering to their feet and running from the room again. "This way," Marcus yelled, pointing to another room. This time there was a door that they could shut, and pushing a cabinet over against it while they worked to open a window. It wouldn't open all the way, so they tossed their packs and then climbed through one at a time. Zoe was first, followed by Brandy, and Santa was at the door now, slamming into it as it growled and snarled. Marcus barely made it out before the door gave way and in came the beast. It had started snowing and there was a thick layer already starting to form over the cobblestone path they were now standing on. And just as the three thought they were safe, Santa burst through the window. Being slightly budgy now, the narrow window was too small for it to fit all the way through. It became wedged in, one arm flailing about trying to grab one of the children, and its coat covered its mouth, gaped open, showing its blood-crusted teeth and tongue. "Run!" Marcus said, and he and Zoe had already started to take off when they heard a scream. And looking back, they saw that Brandy had tripped. No, the tongue had shot out of Santa's grotesque mouth and was wrapped around her feet and dragging her towards it. The pair ran back and grabbed at her hands, pulling as hard as they could, but the snow was making the stone slick, so they were being dragged along, too. Marcus threw the bags at the creature, but he didn't seem fazed at all by this. The contents of the bags were strewn out onto the ground, including Billy's flare gun. And seeing it, Marcus had an idea, but he couldn't reach it without letting go of his cousin. Brandy was now close enough that Santa could grab her with his hand. Instead, it lashed out at the other two, knocking them away and allowing the poor girl to be drawn into its mouth. Before its mouth could shut, however, Zoe jumped up, grabbed Brandy, and pulled her most of the way out, using the wall to push away. The jaws slammed closed, snapping Brandy's legs off in one nearly clean cut. She screamed in pain but fell away with Zoe, and the two rolled out of reach once more. While this was happening, Marcus rolled across the ground from being hit by Santa, and quickly he scrambled to his feet and grabbed the flare gun. As soon as Zoe and Brandy were clear, he aimed at what he assumed was the monster's eyes and fired. The bright red, searing hot flare lodged itself into Santa's neck, setting the fake beard, hair, and hat on fire. The creature screeched and threw itself back into the building and could be heard crashing around inside. Marcus ran to his cousin's side. Seeing her condition, he finally started fully crying, and shaking from the pain and shock, Brandy grabbed his hand. "Belts, tourniquet," she managed to mutter out. Marcus nodded, stripping off his belt and tying it around one of her legs, while Zoe did the same to the other. The bleeding slowed, but she wasn't out of the woods yet. Using their backpacks and some wood planks, they made a makeshift stretcher to carry her out of the woods. Before leaving, the three looked back at Santa's workshop that was now on fire and with a plume of smoke rising through the air. With no time to stay and watch it burn down, they left, trying to make it back to town. Just as they made it out of the woods, they were met by the sheriff and fire engines on the way to put out the fire. The three were taken to the hospital, and a couple of days later were all sitting in a room together. Brandy was still asleep while Marcus and Zoe held her hands. "So, a bear did this?" asked Sheriff Thompson, an older man with greying hair. After a moment and a glance at each other, the two nodded. With a sigh, he shut the door. 30 years ago, some kids went missing in and around that village. I'm sure that's why you four went out there," he said and sat down. "I've seen many bear attacks and, well, bears, they can't do this. Not this neat." Thompson continued, pointing to Brandy's legs. "I'd wager you saw something out there. Something odd. Something monstrous," the sheriff said, raising a brow as he saw them go white. I seen it too. 30 years ago. At that time, it looked like a boy that had gone missing. Till it lurched out and tried to take my arm off," he said. Marcus and Zoe looked at each other and then back to him. "So, you knew it was out there?" Zoe asked. "Yep, but I thought it was dead. When that boy changed and tried to bite me, I shot him. He screeched and ran off into the woods. I tracked him to a river, but I lost him. I figured either my bullets or the water would do him in. Now, apparently, I was wrong," Thompson said, lowering his head. "You said, at the time it looked like a boy?" quoted Marcus. "Yes, we'd, a hunter of sorts, and I figured out it was some kind of shapeshifter. I could take on the appearance of anything that had eaten. I knew there was a chance the boy was a monster, but I couldn't bring myself to shoot him and be wrong about it," he said, and then eyed them. "What did it look like to y'all?" he asked. "Santa," Zoe said. Mr. McDarlin, the former owner, he always dressed like Santa. Thought he'd just run off to avoid a lawsuit or something. Wrong again, I suppose," he said, shaking his head. "Well, I'ma head out. Take my advice and stick with a bear story. Don't want to end up in a nut house," he said, and started for the door. "Sheriff Thompson?" Marcus called out. "Yep," the man replied. "Is it dead now?" Marcus asked. You set it on fire and burned the building down around it. I sure as hell hope so," Thompson said, and stepped out of the room, closing the door again. Marcus and Zoe got up and went to the window, standing side by side, looking out at the field and forest behind the hospital. "This is all my fault," Zoe sobbed. No, it's not. You couldn't have known about that thing," he said, pulling her into a tight hug. They remained in each other's embrace for a long moment, both crying and sniffling. And Marcus glanced back at the window again, jolting away from Zoe, who then looked out as well. In the distance, standing at the edge of the tree line, was Billy, just as he'd been right before he died. The two shot a look to each other, horror on their faces, before looking back out to where he'd been. But he, or it, was gone. Wow. Certainly a chest pounding and a festive treat there from the incredible mind of James Williams. Thank you ever so much, brother, for quickly penning this one so quickly on top of the last two series. And at such a busy time of year. From my family to yours, Merry Christmas, brother, and I hope you all have a fantastic New Year. Well, guys and girls, as ever, please do let me know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. If you're an aspiring writer, why not get your story over to me at the usual email address as on screen, which is dmtforestofear@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Hope everybody's doing well this week, getting stuck into whatever it is that you do. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.